Just waiting on a couple more. Thank you to those of us joining. We are going to get started in a minute, just waiting on one or two more people. Okay, I'm going to start now. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the final webinar in SciAIM's Inclusive Practice series. My name is Lee Nightingale, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm SciAIM's Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Engagement Officer. Today, we are joined by Helen Musgrove from Lexic. Helen is the Director of Psychological Consulting at Lexic, a specialist psychological consultancy focused on empowering neurodiversity in the workplace. We're so grateful to have Lexic with us on our Green Jobs for Nature initiative, and I cannot wait to see what Helen has in store for us today. Please feel free to use the chat functionality within Zoom or to ask questions you have in the Q&A box. We'll be answering any Q&A towards the end of today's session. So with that, I will hand over to you, Helen.
Thank you very much, Lee. I'm just going to share my screen so you can all see my slides. Wonderful. So I think that screen sharing is enabled now. So thank you so much to Lee and SciAIM for inviting me to this session today. It's a real pleasure to be part of the Green Jobs for Nature project and to have worked hand in hand with SciAIM on a range of projects over the last year or so. As Lee said, I'm Director of Psychological Consulting at Lexic, so I'm a business psychologist by profession with that specialism in neurodiversity. You can use the chat, you can ask your questions as well, but I do also would really value some interaction from you during the session, because I've got a number of questions that I would like your input on. And so the best way to do that is through joining our Slido here, which you can do by scanning the QR code with your camera on your phone. Or you can go to slido.com and enter that code there, 2757088. So every time I ask a question, those details will appear again. So don't worry if you don't get them down now. The session is going to last till 1 o'clock. Do feel free to do whatever you need, get up, wander around, make a cup of tea. It's entirely up to you. And hopefully it feels like a safe and comfortable space for everybody. So Lexic's been going since 2007. Our specialism in neurodiversity in the workplace in particular, and our psychologists work with both individuals providing things like assessment and coaching services, and with organisations as well. So that's what my team does. We provide training and consultancy services to organisations in the UK and increasingly internationally as well. Today we're going to look a little bit about what we mean by neurodiversity, some of the traits, strengths and workplace challenges that can be associated with particular neurodifferences, the value of neurodiversity and neuroinclusion at work, and then deep dive down more into recruitment. So what's the case for neuro-inclusive recruitment? How can we really attract neurodivergent talent, assess neurodivergent talent effectively, and then I'll finish off by telling you a little bit about how Lexic can help. So first, what do we mean by neurodiversity? Well, neurodiversity refers to the different ways that people's brains process information. So the different ways that they think, the ways that they experience and interact with the world around them. And individuals whose way of thinking differs significantly from the majority are often described as neurodivergent. And you can see a range of specific neurodifferences in the wheel on the right-hand side here. So things like dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD, autism spectrum conditions, which I'm going to come on to talk about in a moment. You can also acquire neurodifferences as well through things like a brain injury or stroke. We don't have time to get into the details of those today, but it's important to be aware. Another definition for you, neurotypical refers to people whose way of thinking is consistent with the neuromajority. So together, neurotypical people, neurodivergent people make up that spectrum of neurodiversity. And the neurodiversity model really proposes that we should value and respect diversity in neurodevelopment in the same way as we do diversity in other human variations like gender, race, or sexual orientation. And it moves us away from the deficit model that was common in the past and still prevalent sometimes today as well, which can view neurodivergence as a disorder in an impairment, implying that there's a right and a wrong way of thinking. The reality is that neurodivergent people generally have something that researchers call a spiky profile. So there's a more pronounced disparity between their cognitive strengths and their cognitive challenges than we generally see for their neurotypical peers. So first of my Slido questions for you. Do you know what proportion of the population is neurodivergent? See if we can get a few people answering questions here. Great. So let's see what you think. So we're going for a majority there, 1 in 10. So that's a bit of an underestimate. What we know from research, the Birkbeck University have reviewed all of the research in this area. They've concluded that at least 1 in 7 people are neurodivergent. They think the reality, though, is it's probably more like 1 in 5 because a lot of people will not be aware that they're neurodivergent, particularly if they grew up in a time when it wasn't something that was really talked about. Other people might not feel comfortable to share that information with researchers. Either way, it's a lot of people. It's a lot of people in your organisations, in your candidate pools, friends and family as well. A few other things to note, we see a higher rate of diagnosis for males than for females. We think, though, from research now that that's more to do with a lack of awareness amongst medical professionals, education professionals about neurodifferences in girls and women. And we're seeing that gap close all of the time. We see co-occurrence commonly between neurodifferences within the same people. So 60% of neurodivergent individuals will have more than one neurodifference. So we see a lot of overlap there in traits. We also see commonly co-occurrence with mental health conditions such as anxiety and depression, and physical health conditions as well, such as joint hypermobility and pain. So people might have a number of different things that kind of all impact on their experience of their neurodifference. We quite often see misdiagnosis as well, particularly amongst girls and women, of neurodifferences being kind of missed or misdiagnosed as a mental health condition. It's also important to say that neurodifferences don't exist in a vacuum. So someone's experience is going to be impacted by other intersectional characteristics that they might have. Their gender, race, sexual orientation, socioeconomic situation, the cultural context they're in as well. And that's important to note, particularly in your recruitment, that people may have multiple levels of marginalisation that they've experienced, particularly if you're recruiting on a global basis. You may find that people have quite a different cultural experience that's impacted their experience of their neurodifference. Neurodiversity goes to the heart of many people's identities, and people have different preferences around terminology. On the slide here, you can see some of the different ways that people might describe themselves. So some prefer person-first language, some identity-first language. Some people say that they're neurodivergent, others might describe themselves as being neurodiverse. For the purposes of this training, I'm using the term neurodivergent, but if you're speaking to an individual, I'd always suggest taking your lead from them. Be aware too that some neurodivergent individuals will identify as disabled and others won't. So sometimes it can feel a bit confusing. I think the key thing is to not let worrying about making a mistake stop you from talking about neurodiversity. Just listen to what someone tells you about how they identify and try and respect that. So obviously, everyone's different, as I've said, but there are some traits, some strengths, some challenges that research suggests are commonly associated with particular neurodifferences. And it's important that we've got a bit of an awareness of this in order to inform then, what we might do in terms of recruitment. So from the first of our neurodifferences, dyslexia is the most common. It affects around 10% of the population, and it affects short-term memory and the skills involved in accurate and fluent reading and spelling. And some of the strengths we often see associated with dyslexia, things like visual thinking, creativity and entrepreneurship, often great verbal articulation, often really good at seeing the big picture, making connections across different issues, and can bring really unique perspectives to solving problems. Some of the challenges people might have at work can be things like note taking, written communication, absorbing lots of information at once, particularly if that's lots of dense text or lots of information from different sources. With those challenges in short-term memory, it can be difficult to learn new processes, and organisation can be difficult as well. So really there are challenges around reading, writing, processing speeds and memory, and kind of organisation sometimes and planning. Then we have developmental coordination disorder or dyspraxia, which affects around 5% of the population, and it affects movement coordination and organisation. So some of the strengths we might see associated with dyspraxia, things like original ideas, creativity and problem solving, high levels of determination. Some of the challenges people might experience can be around things like time management, planning, following directions, so whether that's instructions or kind of navigational directions, things involving fine motor skills like typing or handwriting, things involving gross motor skills as well. So depending on the environment that you're in, that can bring kind of greater or kind of lesser challenges. Then we have dyscalculia, which affects around 7% of the population and affects the acquisition and use of everyday mathematical skills, including number perception and symbol recognition. So dyscalculia can be associated with strengths such as strategic thinking, problem solving, good vocabulary. Challenges in the workplace can include things like financial transactions, planning out, managing budgets, working with numerical data in spreadsheets, for example. Also, people might have challenges around time concepts, so estimating how long something's going to take them, and then kind of managing time effectively as well. Then we have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. We usually just say ADHD, which affects between 4 and 5% of the population. And it can be associated with three key traits, all linked to things like executive functioning. So we have hyperactivity, impulsivity, and challenges around regulating, switching, sustaining attention. So people won't necessarily have all three of those traits. They can kind of manifest in different combinations. Some of the strengths that people often have associated with ADHD, things like stamina, enthusiasm, and energy, often really good at engaging and motivating other people around them, often very creative and entrepreneurial, good problem-solving skills, adaptable. They're people who are often great to have in a crisis or with a big impending deadline, and also something called hyperfocus. So hyperfocus is the ability to really focus in on a particular task, get very absorbed in it, be highly productive, highly creative. And that can be brilliant in terms of results, but it can also make it hard then to switch attention to another boring work task that needs to be completed, or domestic things as well, like remembering to eat or go to bed, for example. Other challenges that people might have at work can be things like challenges around organisation, around time management and prioritisation, around concentration and focus, and that sort of switching, regulating attention. Getting going on or seeing tasks through to completion, so lots of brilliant ideas, actually seeing them all the way through to turn them into a reality might be harder. You may also see ADHD as interrupting colleagues in meetings or group exercises, things like that. It's hard to keep those ideas in, and people might worry that they're going to forget them. ADHD can also be associated with emotional regulation challenges, and in particular, something called rejection sensitive dysphoria, which is sort of heightened sensitivity to feelings of rejection or criticism. And that's something to bear in mind, particularly when you're looking at things like feedback. Finally, here we've got autism spectrum condition, which affects between 1 and 2% of the population. Normally, we just say autism. It affects how a person communicates with and relates to other people and how they experience the world around them. And as the name implies, there can be a spectrum of different autistic experiences. So some of the strengths that can be associated with autism, things like logical thinking, good analytical skills, often good memory and attention to detail, often very in-depth knowledge of particular areas of interest or specialism, can bring unique perspectives to solving problems, just looking at the world slightly differently, often very reliable, preference for routine and ability to stick to that. Contrary to what you'd see in the media often, autistic people can have high levels of empathy, it just might be expressed a little bit differently. And often that real sense of integrity and fairness and honesty. So really useful in organisations to have people who are prepared to say the things other people aren't brave enough to say, maybe point out risks, stand up for people as well. So that can bring real value. It can also sometimes have some challenge associated with it because autistic people often have quite a direct style of communication. And if people don't understand what sits behind that, they might interpret it as rudeness. Change can also be challenging for autistic people, can be quite stressful. Not knowing what to expect can cause quite a lot of anxiety in a situation. Interpreting ambiguous communications and tasks can also be a challenge. So communications or questions that are very vague, very hypothetical, tasks that aren't clearly explained, and particularly where like the reason for them isn't explained. So I think, bear in mind that when you're thinking about, when we come on to talk about things like questions that you might ask in an interview, that people may interpret a question very literally, and they may need to have kind of the specifics of that really spelled out, and can't necessarily expect people to make those leaps and inferences. It can also be difficult to interpret other people's behaviour. So some of those social cues that might somehow be instinctively obvious to other people might not be to an autistic person. So when to look away, when to start and stop speaking, how close to someone to stand, some of those unwritten rules of workplaces and interview settings as well. Just, might be something that an autistic person has to really think through, really focus on, really learn from kind of their interactions with other people rather than that be instinctive. Some, though certainly not all autistic people, may find eye contact quite uncomfortable. May also display different body language. So particular something called stimming, which is repetitive movements that someone may do when they feel kind of under pressure in particular, can help to calm themselves down in a stressful situation. So that might be things like tapping legs, drumming fingers, twirling hair, for example. All things to kind of be aware of, certainly in that sort of interview scenario. Finally, people might be hyper, so over or hypo, under sensitive to stimuli in the environment. And that hypersensitivity can be a particular challenge because it can lead to something called sensory overload, which can create discomfort, fatigue, and a difficulty focusing. So that might be sensitivity to things like noise, to bright lights, to smells, patterns, and textures. Now, I've got a video to show you now, just to help you understand a little bit more what that experience might be like of that sensory sensitivity. So this video lasts for about a minute and a half. So it is designed to be, quite a bit fuzzy, a bit bright, a bit loud. So if you don't want to watch it for any reason, that's fine. Just look away, maybe pop out, make a quick cup of tea or something for the next 90 seconds or so. Oops. So I don't know about you, but even watching that for 90 seconds kind of leaves me feeling quite slightly stressed and anxious. And I think, it helps to imagine if you're thinking about things like interview or assessment center settings, about how much more stressful that might be for someone who has those sorts of experiences of the environment around them. And it's something that's a little bit hard for other people to understand, I think, which is why I wanted to show that to you. Um, so there is definitely a really important kind of both business case and I think moral and legal case as well for making sure that our recruitment processes are as neuro-inclusive as possible. And we're going to come on to looking at that now. So there are, when you think about those strengths that I talked about that are often associated with particular neurodifferences, some real business benefits to making our recruitment processes more neuro-inclusive. And the first is that neurodivergent people can be really productive if we can increase the flow of neurodivergent people into our organisations, then organisations like JP Morgan, like Siemens, like EY, have all shown the benefits that that can have for productivity. Thinking back to what I said about those problem-solving skills, we can improve problem-solving, decision-making. As I think we've discussed at kind of SAIM events before, there's some really big challenges that you're dealing with in your sector. And I think, you want people who think differently, who can solve problems that we've grappled with, for decades. It can increase innovation and creativity in our organisations. We can make use of that much wider talent pool, that diverse skill set, including of the communities that you serve as well. It can improve reputation as an employer, and ultimately it can increase employee well-being, engagement and retention as well. We see leading employers now really starting to kind of make some good progress in this area and see the benefits of doing so. So I just wanted to highlight one example to you, which is Microsoft. So Microsoft have a neurodiversity hiring program that seeks to attract talented neurodivergent candidates and provide the training and support needed for career growth and success. So one of the things that they do is they invite applicants to a hiring event that focuses on skill development, interview preparation, really understanding what it's like to work at Microsoft. So they have the opportunity there to meet other neurodivergent employees who've been through that program and interviewers in informal as well as formal settings. They then do various things to support neurodivergent individuals post-hiring as well, but I'm just focusing on the hiring elements here today. And they see a retention rate then of more than 90% because they're equipping people both to understand whether this career is the right career for them, to reduce the anxiety that people might experience going into that recruitment process, and I think, making sure that they then get the right people for those roles. And they've said of it, Microsoft believes that diversity enriches our performance and products, the communities where we live and work, and the lives of our employees. We believe there's an untapped potential in the marketplace and roles that would set future employees up for success. So as I mentioned, there's also a legal case for neuro-inclusive recruitment. So as I mentioned at the start of this session, neurodivergent individuals may not identify as disabled, but the reality is that most will meet the definitions of disability under the Equality Act 2010, which isn't sort of specific to the particular disability condition that somebody has. It's more about the impact that that has on their kind of day-to-day life. So if they do meet that definition, then they'll be entitled to legal protections in the hiring process and the workplace. So essentially, employers must not discriminate against disabled people at any stage of the recruitment process. And employers must also make reasonable adjustments to remove or reduce a disadvantage related to someone's disability. So, in the hiring process in particular, that's about making those kind of practical changes to the process that mean that someone won't experience a disadvantage within it, that they'll have the same chances as somebody else as success in that recruitment exercise. So, we're not talking about special treatment here. We're just talking about leveling the playing field, give them the same chances of success as other candidates would have by removing that disadvantage. So I've got another question for you now. Can you think of any challenges or barriers that neurodivergent candidates might experience within traditional recruitment processes? Thinking about some of the traits that I've already talked about, maybe thinking about the kind of wider society that we're part of. Sorry, for some reason that didn't come through there for a while. Yeah, potentially brain fog, absolutely, might go off topic, and particularly in things like interviews. Social acceptance, yeah, and you've got several people in front of you, often in an interview, who you need to persuade that you're the right person for the job. They might have their own biases as well. Yeah, potentially writing CVs and application forms, particularly if you find it difficult with written communication, maybe reading and understanding and processing. Focus on writing expansive applications. Yeah, that can, when faced with a really long application form, that can definitely be problematic. How they might be perceived, come across in group situations. Yeah, absolutely. Over talking, getting too much into a flow to allow recruiters to ask questions. Yeah, potentially going off in a million different directions with all your amazing ideas, but maybe finding it hard to structure some of those thoughts. Then we've got here processing interview questions and answering them in the way intended instead of literally. Yeah, so often people are asking questions that actually they don't really mean what they say. They're asking about something else, and you've got to jump and make inferences to work out what it is that they're getting at. That sort of sense that you're being kind of tricked there. Rejection sensitive dysphoria. Yeah, absolutely. That can certainly be an issue both within the process because you're constantly second guessing how you're being judged and perceived all of the time. That can have a lot of anxiety around it. And then maybe with the outcomes of kind of recruitment exercises as well, and kind of that being quite having quite a heavy impact on someone. So we've got making what interviewers might perceive as negative cues, such as a lack of eye contact. Yeah, and you may be, that may be interpreted as being like a bit non-trustworthy, for example, like totally unreasonably, obviously, but people have those kind of preconceptions, I think. Understanding the reason behind questions at an interview. Yeah, again, like second guessing those questions. Eye contact, we've got here again. Maybe come across as, yeah, not confident or rude, absolutely. AI ruling them out because they didn't use specific words in an application. Yeah. Or also, now seeing those video interviews and things where AI is kind of drawing potentially on kind of bias in the first place and then making judgments about those candidates. Yeah, potentially those heightened levels of anxiety. Obviously, interviews and recruitment can be anxiety inducing for lots of people, but if you've got all of these other additional things as well going on, absolutely. Sensory overload, yeah, too much honesty in your answers. Yeah, absolutely. Maybe a bit of oversharing. having to attend interviews in a very unfamiliar environment. Yeah, and not knowing if you'll be accepted at work. Yeah, so you're also trying to get to know the organization, trying to figure out, without giving away too much, what that's going to be like as a place to work, and not knowing unwritten rules exist. Wow, what a good summary of those challenges. Um, I'll talk you through kind of a few things that we know from research and our experience working with clients as well. So I think, fundamentally, some of the barriers that we might experience is that traditional recruitment approaches sometimes screen out the very people who have the creativity and the problem-solving skills that you need for the future. So we have very standardized and scalable recruitment practices. That's where we've kind of moved in recent years, things that can be done like at scale, removing sometimes some of that kind of human element where people might be able to kind of make more informed judgments. Um, we know that we can have bias in the tools used, particularly in things like interviewing as well, where people are bringing all of their own kind of stereotypes, preconceptions into those processes. And we know that from research by Morgeson et al. And what are the implications of this? So 75% of neurotypical candidates were invited to second interviews compared with 30% of neurodivergent candidates in some research by Nicholas et al. And then we also see 46% of neurodivergent individuals who disclose their neurodifference to their employer only do so after starting their job. So people aren't feeling comfortable to talk about their neurodifference during that recruitment process. That means that they don't necessarily get the adjustments and support that they need to enable them to perform at their best in that recruitment process. I mean, obviously, these are just the people who end up getting into the roles. There's going to be all of those other people who didn't get into those roles potentially, who could have been great candidates. So I think you've come up with quite a lot of these already, but some of the specific challenges within assessment processes, a few here for you. So focus, often you're being expected to focus for a long period of time, especially during things like assessment centres, or during psychometric testing that might be kind of really quite draining. And maintaining that focus during those exercises can be really challenging, particularly if you don't have sort of breaks built into them. Memory, particularly an issue for dyslexic people, but also can be for other neurodifferences as well. Challenges with memory can make it difficult to remember the answers that you might have prepared for interview questions, even just remembering a question that's asked and remembering what it is that you're answering as you're talking might be a challenge there. Obviously, also in a kind of in written tests as well, being, trying to recall examples of things that you've done in the past might all be a challenge. Processing speeds can be an issue as well. So particularly doing things like psychometric tests where sort of speed is of the essence. If your processing speed is slower, it takes you longer to read, understand what you're being asked, and that's going to impact on your performance. Social communication, particularly can be a challenge in things like interviews and group exercises. If you're not so comfortable with small talk, if you're misunderstanding questions, interpreting them literally, for example, that might be a challenge. Ambiguity, I mentioned that earlier. If you find ambiguity in questions, tasks, situations difficult, going into a recruitment process where you've really got no idea what you're going to be faced with, and then you're faced with potentially quite a lot of things like hypothetical questions, vague tasks can be a challenge. The sensory sensitivities we've covered already. And then that anxiety as well may well be kind of magnified for a neurodivergent candidate. So those are some of the challenges, but there's lots of good solutions and practical things that we can do as well, which is brilliant to make our processes a bit more neuro-inclusive. So one other thing for you to do, I've not got a slide on this, but you could just do it yourself quickly, if you search for your organization in Google or some other search engine, and neurodiversity, what do you find there? Um, it's a good it's a good exercise to do, because if you're thinking about how attractive are you currently for neurodivergent candidates, um, they are going to be doing that Google search. They're going to be seeing whether anything at all comes up. Um, and you can see from this stat from Text Help here, 93% of neurodivergent workers are more likely to apply for a job at an organisation supporting neurodivergent employees effectively. So the first thing I would say is just make it really obvious that your organisation is committed to neuro inclusion. You can provide things like statements on your website. You can provide case studies of neurodivergent employees, and how they have succeeded in different roles in the organisation. Maybe case studies of people who've been through recruitment exercises in particular, sharing examples of the type of support and adjustments that are available in your organisation, maybe showcasing things like employee resource groups that might exist as well. Just making sure that those things are really visible. Obviously, making sure that there is actually content that sits behind that it's not just like, what would you call it, neuro washing. But I think, being really clear, don't hide all of that stuff behind closed doors just for employees, make it kind of more explicitly obvious to others as well. When you're looking at job descriptions, which is often the kind of first interaction that someone is going to then have with a particular role, think about how that presents the role and think about how it presents your organisation as well. And we tend to see quite lengthy job descriptions, which seem to require, even for quite junior roles, like an amazing and very extensive and very generalized skill set, which is going to be quite off-putting to a lot of neurodivergent individuals who might kind of interpret that quite kind of literally. So a few things I'd suggest here. I'll come on to neurodiversity friendly formatting in a moment. Avoid jargon, vague or figurative language. So things like be a team player, be flexible, which might be difficult to interpret. Make sure that your job descriptions are based on an analysis the skills are actually required for the role in practice, rather than just kind of lazy, like all-rounder sort of skill requirements. This can mean that people just have a better idea of whether or not it's going to be a role that suits them. And it can kind of avoid people not applying because they don't tick, 100% of those boxes. Try and differentiate as well between desirable and essential skills for the role. So neuro-inclusive formatting, you can see on the right-hand side here a graphic that shows how text can seem to sort of swim or dance across the page for dyslexic readers in particular. So a few things here. Just think about your formatting. Use sans serif fonts, at least size 12, 1.5 line spacing, left align text, bullet points, bold headings. Think about compatibility of your job descriptions and any processes with assistive technology as well. So we want to make our recruitment processes as neuro-inclusive as possible. But some candidates may still require additional adjustments, and I'll come back to some examples of those in a minute. But I think, importantly, what you can't do is ask a candidate direct questions about a disability or a neurodifference. That's likely to be against the law in some countries. And that's to make sure that people are offered work on their own merits and aren't discriminated against. But obviously, we do want to make sure that people access adjustments if needed. So alongside your job description and description of your application process, ask candidates whether they need any reasonable adjustments to help them perform at their best during the hiring process. And I'd suggest a general statement welcoming applications from neurodivergent individuals to help people feel safe to request adjustments. You can see a couple of examples here that we kind of found from research, and I think one from a client who was happy for us to share. So, for example, we encourage neurologically diverse applicants from all backgrounds. So if there's anything we can do to make the process better for you and to allow you to show your best self, please let us know. And another one here, which gives some examples. We recognise that some people require extra time to complete tests, require alternative methods of presentation, or benefit from having the interview questions in advance. We're open to any suggestions you may have and are always looking for creative ways to assess talent. So something that both gives people examples of the types of support and adjustments that might be available, but also leaves it open to people to request adjustments that they think might help them. So in terms of that assessment process, I think the first thing is to try and make sure that your application process is as streamlined, is relevant, is really clearly explained to candidates up front. Make sure that people can reach out to the hiring manager if they want to do so, in order to understand a bit more about the process, have the opportunity to ask questions. That can kind of really reduce some of the anxiety they might experience about the process. Make sure any application portals you use are compatible with assistive technology. And consider things like leniency on things like spelling and structure, particularly if those aren't skills that are specific requirements for the role. Then interviews may not always be the best way of assessing people, but I think they're here to stay for better or worse. So think through a few things around how you can make your interviews more neuro-inclusive. So the first thing is the environment. So making sure they're somewhere private, not with like glass walls that everyone can see in, naturally lit, quiet, well ventilated, neutrally decorated, if possible. Think about sending out questions in advance. That's something that we do at Lexic for all of our our kind of job recruitment. We find it works really well. We've not seen any disadvantage of it. It just helps people to perform at their best and prepare effectively for interviews, neurodivergent or not, to be honest. Be ready to rephrase or clarify questions during the interview. Often people will benefit from having the questions put into the chat if you're doing a virtual interview, or on a piece of paper so that they can read it as well as listen to it, where people might have challenges around auditory processing. That can be helpful. Allow for pauses for people to process questions and formulate responses. Help bring them back on track as well if they kind of lose the thread of their answer. Make sure that you offer breaks in an interview, particularly if it's going to be someone that's kind of going on for a long time. Make sure that your assessors are trained to understand a bit more about neurodiversity and kind of the risks of bias within their own assessment. So pointing out things like, body language, communication style, things like spelling mistakes as well. Just trying to make sure that those aren't being misinterpreted and people aren't being unfairly judged on those. The other point I'd say around kind of interviews is that I think we've traditionally had this big focus on cultural fit and identifying people who kind of fit in with how we do things in our organisation. And whilst I understand the reasons for that, I think, if we reach the conclusion that there is value to be had in people who think differently, who might challenge the status quo, then I think the better thing to do is to assess for cultural add rather than cultural fit. So what are they going to bring to this team that we don't already have within it, rather than are they just going to be identikit of everyone else who's already there, or recruiting in your own image if you're the boss. So for things like aptitude tests, the first thing I'd say is if you've got multiple choice, if you can try and have an other option with space for text. Some people can find it overwhelming when they're just given options and they don't agree with any of them. That's not how they would respond in a situation. That can be really off-putting. So if you can allow people to respond to that in their own way rather than just multiple choice, that can be useful. If you've got online completion, make sure you've got dictate and read aloud options. Try and provide information visually as well as written. So thinking about things like diagrams, infographics, maybe to help kind of illustrate questions. For timed elements, maybe that offer of additional time might be useful. Allow people the option of saving their work and coming back to it later if they need to take a break during aptitude testing. And generally, if you can avoid situational judgment tests, they can be particularly tricky um, for neurodivergent candidates. Assessment centres, um, I it maybe these are something that aren't used kind of so often in smaller organisations, but often commonly feature around graduate recruitment in particular. So a few things here. Provide detailed information about the process and the adjustments options in advance. Things like familiarisation visits for the venue, having conversations about how all the different elements of the process are going to work. Provide plenty of breaks, provide some private spaces people can go if they need to. Like venue, again, thinking about the sort of sensory elements of that. Make sure that you have assessments that test the specific skills are actually required for the role with clear instructions on how to complete them. It might be that you can be a bit more imaginative in the types of tasks that you're doing that are kind of more aligned to the role itself, to give people the opportunity to showcase their skills. But also try and avoid role plays that require social imagination as well. That can be very stressful and quite tricky for people where they have some challenges around that social imagination. Obviously, take account of any of those tips I've mentioned earlier around specific assessment types. And think about that training for assessors. You've potentially got a wider pool of assessors being involved in that assessment centre process. So, even with these neuro-inclusive processes, some candidates will still need adjustments. If a candidate requests adjustments, discuss with them what might represent a barrier, what adjustments could reduce or remove it. Every situation is different, but here are a few examples of things that you might offer. So, as I think I've mentioned earlier, a meeting or a visit ahead of assessment, extra time for timed exercises, extra breaks, that written copy of interview questions or questions in advance, alternative exercise formats, alternative tasks. So could someone do a practical work-based task rather than the interview potentially? Option of completing online video tasks with a real person instead. Maybe a video or a phone interview rather than a face-to-face interview, or vice versa, depending on what might be kind of particularly challenging for people. Maybe offering a private room for someone actually to complete their tasks in rather than being surrounded by lots of other people, and potentially having a supporter at that assessment as well. So I've got a quick case study for you to hopefully pick up a few of those threads for what I've just been telling you about. And this is a case study linked to an interview for an autistic candidate. So I'm going to ask you for your suggestions in just a moment. So Sophie is autistic. She's applying for a job as an environmental manager. She has good analytical and problem-solving skills and detailed expertise that make her a great fit for the role. She has quite a direct communication style and interprets what people say very literally. She finds it difficult to interpret social cues and to make eye contact when talking to people. She can talk in detail about her experience, but finds it hard to imagine how she'd react in hypothetical scenarios. She can experience sensory overload in bright, noisy environments. She's feeling anxious about the interview and reaches out to discuss adjustments and support. So, how can we ensure that Sophie is able to perform at her best during the interview? Any suggestions from me? So, just as a reminder, she had challenges around kind of hypothetical scenarios. She had challenges around sensory sensitivities, challenges around sort of social communication as well. So yeah, maybe a quiet room for the interview. Option of either in-person or online interview, yeah, depending on what she's more comfortable with. questions beforehand and an opportunity to answer. Yeah, absolutely. Having those questions can reduce that anxiety that people might experience. Assessors having appropriate training. Yeah, absolutely. Some practical work-based options. Yeah. Maybe kind of particular tasks, particular presentations that are sort of linked to someone's role. Questions asked about actual experience rather than hypothetical. Yep, absolutely. Great. There's lots of really good suggestions there. I don't have the answers. I think you've you've come up with most of them there. But I think, the key thing is just trying to be as flexible as you can for the particular individual and not getting too hung up on does someone have a diagnosis or not diagnosis. It doesn't really matter if they're experiencing barriers in the recruitment process and you can help to address some of those barriers, then why wouldn't you? So just to finish off on how Lexic can help in neuro-inclusive recruitment, a few things that we always love getting involved with. First is we can do things like recruitment audits, taking that deep dive look into all of your recruitment processes and reviewing them, making really practical recommendations. We can run workshops for recruitment teams on neuro-inclusive recruitment, again, focused in on the particular recruitment tools that you use, scrutinizing things like your job descriptions, etc. We can provide recruitment toolkits for your recruitment teams, for your hiring managers, and we can also support you through our Neurodiversity Smart accreditation, which looks kind of across all of these different areas of the employee life cycle, customer experience as well, and provides that kind of accreditation that you can share with partners, with candidates, with employees as well, and supporting you around those practical recommendations and implementation. So that's the end of my presentation, but it would be great to have any kind of questions or reflections from you. I don't know whether, can people come off mute?
I don't think people can come off mute in the chat, but we have had some fantastic lived experience coming in from Eden in the chat. And my colleague Brian, who's also on the call with us, hello Brian, has asked us a really interesting question around AI. So I wonder if you could answer this one for us, Helen. Brian has said, we've heard of the use of AI-assessed personality tests being used as part of the initial application process by some organizations. Does this tend to disproportionately disadvantage people who are neurodivergent?
I think the answer is that it definitely has the potential to do so. We unfortunately don't yet have kind of extensive research on this because it's quite a new thing. I think, though, looking at the potential for AI, its learning is all based on potentially, kind of bias assumptions. It's based on what's out there. It's based on it's only as good as the data that goes in. And I think there is quite a lot of potential there for people to face disadvantage in that, particularly when you think about some of people won't necessarily conform to certain sort of societal expectations for like how things are going to be done. That said, there is also some evidence that in certain sort of psychometric tests, sometimes neurodivergent candidates can do better than neurotypical candidates. I think I wouldn't want to kind of rely on that, but I just don't say it doesn't necessarily all go in one direction. Sometimes things like, ADHD, where people might give their instinctive answers more quickly, can actually benefit people in those processes. Sometimes people with great analytical skills can be really good at the kind of numerical reasoning side of things. So it's not that they'll always be disadvantaged, but I think it's always worth understanding that may be a risk.
Yeah, I completely agree, Helen. Thank you so much. I think the whole screening process needs a bit of a look from top to tail, to be honest. We've had a question come in from Eden. Are we able to contact you to talk about your organization? How do we contact you?
Yes, of course. So you can, I think, Lee, maybe when you send round the recording or the slides, feel free to pass on my email address.
Amazing.
But
Thank you.
also, people can just reach out to me on LinkedIn. Always a pleasure to make more connections. And yeah, I'll always respond to a message there too.
Thank you, Helen. We've got another question coming from Andrew. Regarding the percentages of autism, dyslexia, etc. from the beginning, are those for the singular neurodivergent trait, or if someone has dyslexia and autism in that core, you said a different word. I usually use comorbidity, but you've used a new one, which I really need to.
Co-occurrence, because it sounds
Co-occurrence. Thank
better.
you. It's so much better. Co-occurrence. Um, is that even rarer than the percentages that were mentioned on the slide?
So it's not that neat because it's lots of different types of studies from all over the place that have been kind of a meta-analysis completed of them um, in terms of the overall percentages. And then again, like even for the individual ones, I think that will be the proportion of people who have that neurodifference, but they may well have another one as well. So we also know 60% of people have more than one. So um, yeah, I guess. I'm trying to think exactly how that would work in percentage terms. My maths isn't good enough. But yeah, the percentages I've given are the percentages of people who have that neurodifference, but they may have another one as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Helen. Yeah, the co-occurrence, particularly between ADHD and autism, as we've seen with current research, is even more prevalent than they
Yeah,
thought. It's absolutely
and
wild.
it is. And I think that that's the most interesting one to me because so many of the traits seem quite opposite from each other. And I just think it's both brilliant and also you can see quite a challenge to have those things sometimes existing within the same brain.
As someone with ADHD and autism, absolutely.
Pros and cons.
Another question come in from Zihan, which is, how do we prevent the abuse of these accommodations by neurotypical folk?
I think that is something that recruiters worry about, particularly given that we know from kind of from case law certainly that you shouldn't require someone to have a diagnosis in order to put adjustments in place. So you don't have a medical certificate that says necessarily, yes, this person definitely needs these things. You know, to some extent, you're relying upon, um, what someone tells you. Um, I would say though, I mean, would it be the end of the world if someone had like the interview questions in advance and he didn't strictly need the interview questions in advance? I mean, what we find is we give them to everyone, and it means that everyone's able to give their best possible answers. So I would say if there are things that you are worried about could unfairly, disadvantage particular candidates, and then think about whether that's something that you can make available to everyone. But I think, like you want everyone to be able to showcase their skills and in the best way possible for them. So I would say that's more important than probably getting hung up on whether it might mean that a neurotypical person gets an extra kind of advantage if they try and game the system.
I completely agree, Helen. And it's so interesting seeing like on TikTok and social media where there have been adjustments such as, wearing sunglasses inside or wearing headphones, that individuals who don't necessarily need those accommodations are finding it so much more comfortable. And sort of when you create environments that are neuro-inclusive by design, they're just inclusive by design and everyone functions better in that sort of setup. So yeah, I think the more you can do to accommodate all types of neurodifference, including neurotypicals, the better. Some great comments coming in from Eden. I completely agree with the fact that the diagnoses, like dual diagnoses, were only allowed within the last couple of 10 years or so, and so the research hasn't really caught up. And yeah, just underlining the fact that everything being inclusive allows you to choose the best candidate, which I think is absolutely right and always what we should be looking for. So I don't see any other questions coming through, and we are on time. My goodness, God, that flew by, Helen. Thank you so much.
Oh,
I
you're
just,
welcome.
yeah, I honestly, I think I could listen to you talk for hours and hours and hours. So thank you so much for joining us today and for your time in preparing this presentation, and for all of you for joining us today for this webinar. If you want to find out more information, please visit our website or log on to our YouTube channel, where you can view the other webinars in the series alongside this one. To go back to, I will send around, well, I won't, but my wonderful colleague Sarah will send around slides and a link to the recording after the session, and we'll include Helen's contact details in that as well. And once again, thank you so, so much. I really appreciate this, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.